With the murder of his trade caravan and envoy in 1218, Chinggis Khan was now committed to war against the Khwarezmian Empire. From the end of 1219 until his return to Mongolia in 1225, Chinggis Khan embarked on a campaign of conquest and devastation which resulted in the utter annihilation of the Khwarezmian realm. Here, we will look at the preparations made by the Mongols and the Khwarezmians, and give an overview of the course of the invasion, while in succeeding videos go into individual and important events. First, Chinggis Khan held a Khurultai to declare war and establish a plan of attack. The general Mukhali was left with only 20,000 Mongols and thousands of Chinese, Khitan, and Jurchen to continue the war in China. The rest marched west, a vast force not just of Mongolian cavalry, but Khitans, Uyghurs, and Karluks. Unlike the start of the Mongol War against the Jin dynasty in 1211, now the Mongols had access to Chinese siege technology and engineers who traveled with them. Chinggis also wanted the Tangut Kingdom to provide auxiliary forces. Their heavy infantry and cavalry would be a fine addition. But the haughty chief minister of the Tangut, Asagambu, denied Chinggis's request. This was an insult, but not the direct cause of the later destruction of the Tangut Kingdom. The Tangut did provide Mukhali with auxiliaries from 1217 or early 1218 until 1223, after initially refusing. Afterwards, peace talks between the Tangut and the Jin after Mukhali's death sowed the fate of the Tangut, but that's a matter for later. Even without the Tangut, it was still a great host who marched with Chinggis. Somewhere between 100 to 200,000 men are common estimates, not including camp followers and families, and millions of horse, sheep, goat, cattle, and camel with them. One final note is that the succession to Chinggis Khan may have been determined at this point, but that will be dealt with separately. For now, know that all of Chinggis Khan's sons with Borte, Juchi, Chagatai, Ögedei, and Tolui, marched alongside their father. The army set out in spring 1219, reaching the Irtish River that summer. Meanwhile, the Khwarezmian Emperor, Shah Muhammad, suddenly had to organize a defense against the army on the horizon. At some point in 1219, he held a war council in Samarkand, his new capital. There, a meeting of his top generals laid out the options of the Khwarezm Shah. One option, in some sources proposed by the Shah's son Jalal al-Din Mingburnu, was to gather the resources of the empire together and strike the enemy at the Sirdarya River. While they were tired from their long march, the empire could theoretically raise more than 400,000 men, certainly enough to crush any army. Or retreat to Ghazna and fight in that better defensible region, and failing that, retreat to India. Or flee to western Iran, and there defeat the Mongols while they were tired from fighting through Transoxania and Khurasan, with Jalal al-Din holding them back as long as he can. A single pitched battle was seen as too risky, and with such a crisis on the northern frontier, the Shah's presence may be needed south of the Amu Darya to hold the recent and fragile empire together. Ultimately, it was decided to spread their forces across the garrisons of Transoxania and Khurasan, while the Shah stayed beyond the Amu Darya. This decision has been highly criticized down the centuries, but most nomadic peoples lacked siege equipment, so it was logical that strong garrisons would keep important centers safe while the Mongols pillaged outside of the walls. It is often suggested the Shah had developed a phobia of facing the Mongols in open battle after an engagement with Subutai and Juchi, and this may have encouraged him to seek a defense which minimized field engagements. As well, Chinggis's envoys before the massacre at Otrar had placated an angry Shah Muhammad by telling him how mighty his forces were in comparison to that of the Mongols, perhaps leading the Shah to overestimate his strengths. Unfortunately for Shah Muhammad, he didn't know that during the war in China, the Mongols had not just acquired siege weapons, but become proficient in the art of the siege, undermining the key component of the Shah's defensive strategy. Other weaknesses, such as the conflict between Muhammad, his mother, Terkan Hatun, and the Turkic military leadership, created an absence of central organized defense to be taken full advantage of by the Mongols. The Mongols succeeded in gathering intelligence on the strengths and weaknesses of Khwarezm, while Muhammad knew nothing about and completely underestimated the foe he was about to face. Shah Muhammad inspired no leadership, while Chinggis Khan's people followed him across the earth. This was not to be a contest of equals. In autumn 1219, the city of Otrar, on the frontier of Khwarezm, in sight of the merchant massacre in 1218, was where Chinggis Khan's host struck first. The Khwarezmians had likely expected the Mongols to stay together, but Chinggis Khan split his forces. His sons Chagatai and Urgadai were to invest Otrar and bring to Chinggis alive the governor, Inalchuk, who had slaughtered the merchant caravan. His eldest son Juchi was to go downstream of the Sirdarya. A smaller force was sent upriver to Khojend, while Chinggis and his youngest son Tolui took the main army straight across the Kizilkum Desert to Bukhara. Had the Mongols all stayed at Otrar, the Khwarezmians may have been able to bring their weight to bear there. But with the Mongol forces now split apart, striking unexpectedly, every city had to fend for itself. The Kizilkum Desert was thought impassable by a large army, and surely Samarkand, the capital, was the likelier target. But the desert was passed in winter with local guides. The towns of Zarnuk and Nur were the first to surrender, and Chinggis struck the weaker Bukhara in February. Shah Muhammad was beyond the Amudarya in bulk by this time, distant and unable to do anything to help. Transoxania and his homeland of Khwarezm were now left to fend for themselves. At Bukhara, a sortie by the garrison was quickly destroyed, and the frightened citizens surrendered to the Mongols, the citadel holding out but a little longer. Chinggis Khan may have entered Bukhara at this point, perhaps the only time in his life he entered a city, and there told the population that he was the punishment of God, and had they not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him upon them. Chinggis then rounded up the able men of the population and drove them on to his next target, Samarkand. This use of citizens is known in Persian and Arabic sources as hashar, used by the Mongols as arrow fodder, driven before them to push siege equipment, fill in moats, and make the army appear larger. Chinggis Khan arrived at Samarkand, the chief city of Transoxania, in March 1220. Samarkand was strongly defended, a large garrison, perhaps 40 to 60,000 strong, but Chinggis Khan's army was augmented by the forces of Chagatai and Urgadai, who had destroyed Otrar and brought its governor, Inalchuk, to Chinggis. Allegedly, Chinggis Khan punished Inalchuk for his greed by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears. Samarkand's mighty garrison sortied against the Mongols on the third day and were cut down to a man. On the fifth day, the citizens surrendered, but the citadel held out until flooding from a broken dam undermined its walls and the defenders massacred. Craftsmen and artisans in the population were set aside and brought into Mongol service, while much of the remaining were used as hashar. Such a fate awaited many cities of Transoxania and Khurasan. Now Chinggis further divided his forces. Divisions were sent to assist in taking Khojend and into the Fergana Valley. Bodziv, Zubatai, and Chinggis' son-in-law Tokuchar took 3 Tumans to pursue Shah Muhammad. Chinggis took the remainder into the mountains east of Samarkand to rest them for the summer. It was around this time, on the advice of a defector, Chinggis sent letters to Shah Muhammad, his generals, and his mother, Terken Hatun, pretending that he was working with Terken Hatun to attack her son. This increased mistrust between the Khwarezmian leaders, and Terken Hatun fled Khwarezm's old capital, Gurganj, further weakening the defense. While we will give the pursuit of Shah Muhammad its own video, know that Shah Muhammad spent the rest of the year, and the rest of his life, fleeing the Mongols. By mid-April 1220, he had already fled to Nishapur, and soon deep into Iran, accompanied by Jalal al-Din and other sons, until in winter 1220 he died of pneumonia on an island in the Caspian Sea. The Shah took no part in the entire campaign, having fled essentially as soon as the Mongols crossed into Transoxania. His decision to flee ensured that there would be no organized defense against them, leaving each town to its fate. So pitiful was he that the secret history of the Mongols does not even remember his name. Thus was the fate of Muhammad ibn Taqish, Shah of Khwarezm, and briefly, one of the most powerful monarchs on earth. In autumn 1220, Chinggis took Tirmidh, then wintered in modern Tajikistan, sending forces to subdue Badakhshan. At the start of spring 1221, Chinggis crossed to Amudarya and took Balkh, where he sent his son Tolui into Khurasan to secure those cities which had earlier submitted to Xiv and Sukhothai. Tolui's campaign was marked by brutal massacres at cities like Merv and Nishapur. His other sons, Jagatai and Urgadai, were sent to Khwarezm, where they met with Juchi and took the original Khwarezmian capital of Gurganj, perhaps the hardest fought siege of the entire campaign. Chinggis' next target was Tali Khan, which had already held out for several months against the Mongol army. Chinggis took command of that siege, and by the time it fell in early summer, Jagatai, Urgadai, and Tolui had returned with their forces. Juchi moved north, either to subdue Kipchak tribes or spend his time hunting. The portrayal of Juchi here is an interesting one, but complicated, having to do with later Mongol politics, which we'll deal with in detail separately. After Tali Khan fell in summer 1221, Chinggis learned of a shocking development. The new Khwarezm Shah, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu, had defeated two Mongol armies, one under Chinggis' adopted son, the Tatar Shigi Kutuku at Parvan. Jalal al-Din was quite the opposite of his father, a daring and valiant warrior, a natural leader. Jalal al-Din had been at his father's side when he died in winter 1220, when Shah Muhammad confirmed him as his successor. In 1221, Jalal al-Din made it to Gurganj, but fled after a conspiracy against his life was discovered. In the flight, some of his brothers were killed by Mongol forces, but he made it to Ghazna. There he rallied a strong yet mixed force, 20 to 30,000 kingly Turks under his cousin, Amin al-Mulk, and another 20 to 30,000 Karluks, Khalaj, Afghan, and Guri warriors. The Khalaj, led by Saif ad-Din Agrak Malik, though they overcame Shigi Kutuku at Parvan late in summer 1221, which set off revolts across the territory the Mongols had taken. The victory at Parvan stifled Jalal al-Din's resistance. A quarrel between Amin al-Mulk and Saif ad-Din Agrak over loot led to Saif ad-Din abandoning the coalition, along with his troops and a number of other leaders, cutting Jalal al-Din's forces in half. Jalal al-Din had no choice but to retreat to India and seek shelter with the Delhi Sultanate. Chinggis marched rapidly once Shigi Kutuku told him of the defeat. Possibly en route, the Mongols took Bamiyan, during the siege of which Chinggis' favorite grandson, Jagatai's son Mutagun, was killed. No living thing was left in the town by the time the Mongols were done with it, we are told. When the Mongols reached Parvan, Chinggis investigated the site, noting the poor placement of troops both sides had made, and continued on. It was in late November, according to Nazavi, when the Mongols overtook Jalal al-Din, who was preparing boats to cross the Indus River. The battle was fierce, but there could only be one outcome now. Surrounded, his forces being cut down around him, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu spurred his horse over the cliff and into the Indus. Mongol archers made to pick him off as he crossed, but Chinggis Khan himself stopped them. As Jalal al-Din made it to the far riverbank, sword still in hand, Chinggis praised the man's courage to his sons. Those warriors who tried to follow him weren't so lucky, and were picked off by Mongol archers as they swam. The Battle of the Indus in November 1221 effectively marked the end of the Khwarezm campaign. While parties were sent to chase after Jalal al-Din, he escaped and spent several years in India before he returned. Some cities and fortresses still had to be reduced, especially those that rebelled against the Mongols with news of Jalal al-Din's victories. But major operations were complete. The Khwarezmian Empire, the product of some 60-odd years' expansion, had been annihilated in the space of 2 years. For now, only the territory in Khurasan and Transoxania would be incorporated into the empire. But in the next decades, Mongol control expanded across the entire region. After the battle on the Indus River, Chinggis may have considered returning home by scouting south of the Himalayas, possibly even considering attacking India, but ultimately retraced his steps, returning to Mongolia by 1225. The campaign in Khwarezm had been a victory beyond any of their wildest imaginations, and it seemed that heaven itself had mandated it to be so. This has been our overview of the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. In the following videos, we will look at important sieges and battles, such as the siege of Gurganj, the pursuit of Shah Muhammad, and the resistance of Jalal al-Din in greater detail, as well as the important consequences this would have on the future of the Mongol Empire and the Islamic world.